Okay, so we're diving into some really fascinating stuff today. Islamic inheritance law in Malaysia. It can get kind of complicated, right? And we've got a ton of your research here. Articles, legal excerpts, you name it. Ready for a deep dive?
Absolutely. It's an area where, law and culture and personal stories, they all kind of come together. A lot to unpack there.
Yeah, for sure. And that's why you're here. You're like our expert guide in this whole world of inheritance law, especially in the Malaysian context. Now, one article you shared really stood out. Contemporary Challenges in Islamic Inheritance Matters Today from dagnews.com. The author, TNHJ Arifin Sabirin, seems to really know his stuff.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. He's very well respected in the field, years of experience in estate management. When Sabirin talks about the challenges facing Islamic inheritance in Malaysia, people listen. And one thing he does that's really important is make that distinction between what he calls traditional challenges and the contemporary ones. Really important for understanding the bigger picture.
Okay, so let's start with those traditional challenges then. What are we talking about here?
Basically, these are issues that have been around for a long time, decades, really. Sabirin points to disputes between inheritors, family disagreements, also a lack of understanding among people about Islamic inheritance law itself. And then there are the often, hefty fees, associated with managing these estates. And all these things together, they create a kind of bottleneck in the system.
So, not exactly new problems, but what kind of impact are we talking about here? Give us the bigger picture.
Well, according to Sabirin, these challenges have resulted in billions, literally billions of ringgits worth of inheritance assets just stuck, frozen in Malaysia.
Billions. Wow, that's not just a small problem. That sounds like it's impacting like the whole Malaysian economy.
Exactly. It's a huge financial concern. I mean, we're talking about potential investments, family support, economic activity, all on hold. And then on top of all that, we have to layer what Sabirin calls the contemporary challenges.
Okay, so new laws, new problems. Makes sense, but I have a feeling it's a little more complicated than that, right?
Yeah, you're right. You hit the nail on the head. See, it's not always the laws themselves that are the problem. It's often the interpretations of those laws, especially, among the judges handling inheritance cases. Sabrin points out that this has led to some rulings that aren't always consistent, creates a lot of confusion and uncertainty.
Wait, so you're saying two families could be in practically the same inheritance situation, but depending on which judge hears their case, they could end up with different outcomes.
It's a real possibility. And Sabrin actually highlights this in the article. Imagine inheriting some property with your sibling, right?
Yeah.
But what one court sees as a valid document, another court might not. It can get messy.
Talk about a legal maze, right? And it's not just about the money, is it? These situations, they're emotional. We're talking family legacies, cultural expectations, religious obligations. That's a lot to navigate.
Oh, absolutely. And that's where understanding the Malaysian legal system, particularly its dual court structure, becomes really crucial.
Okay, break that down for us. What does dual court structure actually mean in this context?
So in Malaysia, you have civil courts and Sharia courts, right?
Oh.
Each has its own designated area of jurisdiction. It's outlined in Article 121(1)(a) of the Malaysian Constitution. Seems pretty straightforward, but when it comes to Islamic inheritance, it can get a bit murky.
Because it could potentially fall under either jurisdiction.
Exactly. That's where you run into potential conflict. Something that Sabirin is clearly concerned about in the article. He even draws a parallel to that case, the Kelantan Siaraya Criminal Code. Remember how some parts of that were actually ruled unconstitutional because they were clashing with federal law?
Yeah, okay. So there's a precedent for this kind of legal back and forth. Wow, that's a lot to unpack already. We've got these evolving laws, potential conflict between courts, and we haven't even gotten into the emotional side of family inheritance. This is getting pretty deep, even for a deep dive.
And we're just getting started. But that's exactly why understanding these nuances, it's so important. It's about equipping yourself, protecting your rights, and making sure things go a little smoother for your family. Yeah, and that's what makes this whole area of law so fascinating, right? It's always changing, and there's this human element to it. It's not just, words on paper. It's real families dealing with this stuff.
So how does this actually play out in real life? Like, can you give us an example?
Sure. Imagine a family, let's say they've got assets that are tied to both civil and Sharia law, maybe a family business and then some inherited land. Figuring out the inheritance there, it means you got to understand both systems and how they interact, right? It gets complicated. That's why Sabirin's point about getting expert advice is so important. This isn't something you want to just, Google and figure out yourself.
Right, like trying to fix your car engine without knowing which tool is the wrench. You're really hitting home that point about expert advice.
Exactly. And it's not just about knowing the law as it is right now, today. It's understanding that it can change. What's true now, it might evolve as new precedents come up, new interpretations. That's why staying informed is so important.
So it's always shifting. You really have to stay on top of it. But doesn't that create kind of a barrier for some families, especially those who maybe can't constantly be paying for legal advice?
You're right, that's a really important point.
Hmm.
It underlines the need for better access to legal information, more resources. Imagine if there were more of those community legal clinics
Hmm.
or workshops, even online resources. Something to make this stuff easier to understand for everyday Malaysians.
I like that. Empowering people, right? Giving them the knowledge to handle these situations, no matter their background. That's something policymakers should think about.
Absolutely. Access to justice, it shouldn't be a luxury, right? But going back to the challenges, legal interpretations, even among judges, they're not set in stone either.
You mean even if, like, magically we could fix all these problems today, there's no guarantee that new ones wouldn't pop up later on.
That's the thing about the law. It evolves. New situations come up, new cases, new interpretations. It's ongoing. And that's why, in addition to having legal expertise, it's crucial for families to communicate clearly amongst themselves.
You're talking about having those, sometimes difficult inheritance conversations before things get messy.
Exactly. Openly talking to each other, getting those wishes documented, understanding the legal process. That can prevent so many problems down the line. Really save families a lot of heartache and uncertainty.
Makes sense. So we've covered a lot of ground here. The dual court system, those conflicting interpretations, the importance of staying informed. But what about on an individual level? If someone's listening to us now, what can they do? For themselves, for their families, how do they get started with all of this?
It really starts with awareness. Just, listening to this deep dive. It's a great first step. You're already thinking about these things. And so many people, they put it off way too late.
Yeah, don't bury your head in the sand.
Exactly. Start talking with your family. What are your wishes? What are you worried about? These inheritance conversations, they can be a little, sensitive, but they're so important.
Getting everyone on the same page.
Exactly. And once you've got a better idea of what your family wants, what they need, that's when you bring in the experts.
Right. Find that legal professional who can really guide you. Make sure everything's documented correctly, help you navigate the system.
Yeah, think of it like a tailor making a custom suit. You don't want a one-size-fits-all for something this important, right?
So if we had to pick one key takeaway from our deep dive today, what would it be? What should our listeners really remember?
I'd say remember that Islamic inheritance law in Malaysia, it's not static. It's constantly evolving. It's not enough to just memorize some rules. You have to really understand the principles. Stay informed and don't be afraid to get expert advice.
It's about protecting your family's legacy, right? And making sure that wealth is transferred smoothly, fairly, according to your wishes and Islamic guidelines.
Absolutely. And remember, this is just the start. Keep asking questions. There are resources out there. Learn about them and keep those conversations going with your family.
You've given us a lot to think about today, the challenges, the complexities, but also, a path forward. So for our listeners, as you continue your own deep dives, here's a final thought to ponder. We've talked about getting help from experts, but what if you could be your own expert, right? What if there were resources, tools that could really empower everyday Malaysians to understand their rights and options when it comes to Islamic inheritance? Something to think about.
That is a fantastic question and a great note to end on. Remember, everyone, knowledge is power. So until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep those important conversations going.